Hey everybody, today I'm going to work on a video for you guys, long overdue and much requested video, the most requested topic that I've had, on how to draw a likeness, how I get my proportions right. This is something that eludes a lot of people, and I know that it's something that I've gotten tons of requests on, right? How do you always get your proportions right? For a while, it took me a while to kind of figure out how to do a good video about this. Part of the problem is that, I mean, asking me how do you get the lines in the right place is a bit like asking a guitarist, how do you play the right notes? There's no real trick. I don't use a specific method in terms of, you make a circle and then you divide it in half and blah, blah, blah. I really have worked on this for many, many, many years, decades really. And the basic principle is going from the general to the specific. So, start off with an overall shape, and then you work into to sort of smaller chunks. And one of the things that you'll notice a lot of more experienced artists doing is we don't just look at the features on a face. We'll also look at things like shadows, highlights, form as key points that we do measuring against. Okay. So I've done a number of time lapses and other videos that have sort of shown the process, but I know that that doesn't really help explain it. And so I thought, okay, well, I can do a video where I draw and talk. I mean, I can't really talk because I just can't talk while I draw. But I figured I could do a drawing and then do a voiceover afterwards. But I still thought, all I'm really telling you is, okay, I put a line here. And I don't know that that's that helpful. So I started to think, well, what is it that I can do that could really be helpful for everyone? And what it dawned on me is, and for any of you that have taken courses or read a lot of books, learning to draw is really not about learning to put lines in certain places. It's about learning to see. And I think that the best thing that I can show you guys is what I see when I draw. When I look at a reference shot or when I look at a live model, I don't just see eyes and nose and mouth. I see shapes. And I think that I can explain that fairly well. So the process in this video is going to be, I'm going to do this drawing, but I'm going to first of all show you, I'm going to take a photo. We're going to do a drawing of The Rock because he's awesome and he's bald, which is actually helpful for me to show you the whole process. I'll explain also if you wanted to put in hair what it would look like. But the first step that I'm going to do in the next part is I'm going to take a photo of him and overlay some acetate, and I'm going to show you how I see the lines on the face. And then once I've done that, I will do a video of me drawing it, and I'll try and splice the two together so you can see. Okay, I see this line. This is what I understand, and then I do that. And unfortunately, I don't think you're going to come away from this instantly being a better artist or better at accuracy, but hopefully it puts you on the right path, so that you understand what it is that you're trying to achieve, what the end goal is. I did about 350 portraits last year. I've done, on a conservative estimate, probably 3,500 portraits in my life. So this is something that if you want to get to a certain level, you need to put in the hours. There's no substitute for practice, and there's no substitute for the work. People always say to me, oh, you're so fast at it. Well, I never tried to get fast at drawing. It's just I draw a lot. I draw every day, basically, many, many, many hours a day. And the speed comes with it, and the accuracy comes with it. So anyway, this is the first part of the video. I'm going to now go to the board, my drawing board, and we'll do a bit of work on what I see, and then I will get into the next part, okay? Hopefully it all kind of comes together because I'm going to do some voiceovers, etc. So bear with me. Thanks. Okay, guys, so here we are in the second part of this video. So like I said, I want to show kind of how I see a drawing. So as you draw more, you start seeing things that other people don't see. I find myself when I'm talking to someone, we'll be having a meal or something, and I'm actually looking at, the shape of their nose or the side of their face, especially if there's some kind of unusual lighting going on. And I'm always sort of breaking down planes and things. So when I look at a photo or when I look at a live model that I'm working with, I see things differently. I don't just see, an eye and a nose. I see the whole shape. And so I want to break it down. I was going to draw right on the photo, but I thought if I do it on some acetate, then I can actually show you it. I'll take it off the photo and we'll sort of see how it goes. So I'm just going to tape it in place so that it doesn't move around on me. Green tape is the best if you guys are going to be taping anything. Painter's tape, it'll still probably wreck this because it's just like a photocopy type paper, but it worked really well for anything that you want to tape down. Doesn't tear things off like most masking tape. So I'm going to start off with a red marker. When I look at a portrait, the first thing I do is get a sense of the overall shape, right? So I would kind of block in, top of head to chin. And I mentioned in the earlier part, it's nice that the rock has no hair, because when we do draw hair, it actually ends up being quite a bit higher for most people. So this way we can look at the whole head. And sometimes I will actually draw in where I think the head ends with someone that has hair, just because it gives me a sense of proportions for the rest of the face. Okay. So once I have an idea of, and I might actually even just, get that sort of a sense, but once I have that, then I really sort of gently would block in an outline. Okay. At this point, if you read books about art, what you get a sense of is that the eyes are halfway down the head. Well, they're not halfway down the head exactly. So it is important now to kind of get a sense of where about those eyes are, right? So I would look and I'd see that in the rock's case, his head is, like this. His eyes are just a little bit higher than halfway. Okay, and that is normally my next line. So once I've sort of and again, with this, you get one sort of strength. When I'm drawing, I will use the pencil very, very lightly. When I do the demo later, I'll go darker than I normally do, and I'll probably have to erase some of it. But you want enough sort of lightness that you can go over those lines and correct them as you go. Okay. The next line would generally be down the middle of the face. If you're drawing a circle and they're dead on, then it's going to be something like that. But because his face is turned, that center line is also turned. Okay. There's not always a rhyme or reason to what order I do them in, but the nose line and the mouth line, those are both sort of key. And again, I'm taking note of, his eyes are a little bit high on his face. His nose is roughly, in this sort of a breakdown, and his mouth is quite high compared with a lot of people. He's got this huge smile, so I would work out where that ends. And that may be in relation to the eyes. A lot of this is sort of instinctive, unfortunately, right? But this is the path that you want to be following. And he's got this very pronounced chin, so I'd probably work that in too. And as I work on the drawing, there's a good chance that I'll get things slightly in the wrong place. And that is part of the process, right? You put things down, you realize they're not quite right, and you correct them. The width of the nose, obviously. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of the times these things sort of fall in the right place for me, but there's certainly no harm in saying, okay, well, where, if we draw an imaginary line up, where does it come on his eyeball? Right? On this side, it's like right in dead center. On this side, it's over here because he's looking this way, right? His eyeballs are this way. I quite often will figure out the eyebrows at this point before I even work out the eyes. I don't know why that is. It's maybe a shape thing. But I will also look at things like this and how this breaks down. Okay. And you start seeing how things are coming together. The sort of landmarks that I use to figure out the face. Okay. I will often indicate an upper eyelid as a starting point. But sometimes I'll even do one of these, right? Because I know what the eyeballs are like, and you've seen in some other videos, there's a real importance to drawing skulls, okay? He has these huge smile lines because of his huge smile. So those I will probably break down, okay? And then you just begin refining things. I'm going to switch to a different color pen just so that you can kind of see one over the other. So once I've got those in place, I would probably, I love noses. I find them to be the most interesting part of the face. The eyes obviously are the most important, but the nose is really where things sort of come together. It's quite often the most interesting shape, and the curves in it are really kind of often very interesting. And I may well go to the mouth next. I'm not sure. There's no, as I said, there's no important order that you do things. With the eye, with the mouth, I've got, I believe I have one or two demos on drawing the mouth. Less is more. You don't want to put too much information in with the mouth because it will definitely, you'll end up looking like Frankenstein, and we don't want that. Okay, and somewhere along the line I will block in his body, just so that he's not a floating head, and it gives you a sense of kind of the relationship of his face to everything else. He has this huge square jaw, and I always forget the ear. So yeah, I mean, that's kind of how I see things, right? And even things like this highlight here, I look at it as a shape of the furrow of his brow, the little highlights in there. And each one of these gives me a chance to relate to something else on the face. Okay. And so when we now take that off of there, what you end up with is this sort of breakdown, right? And you can see how the red lines give my whole face structure, and then I begin to flesh things out, right? So, I mean, you know, pretty easy when you're tracing over a drawing. Next, I'm going to do the the actual video of me drawing him, but it's a starting point, and I wanted to kind of show you how I see these things. That's probably the best I can do as far as explaining my process. As I said, it's really just putting in the hours to know where these lines need to be, but at least this gives you a roadmap of sort of what to aim for. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to do my drawing on white paper today, which is a little unusual for me, but it should be easier for you to see what I'm doing. I'm going to begin by putting in an oval for the overall shape of the head, and then we're going to do a line for the eyes, which is sort of the next step. But unless you look like this guy, chances are your eyes are not going to be dead center. A lot of books will tell you that the eyes are halfway between the chin and the top of the head, which is what this diagram indicates. And if you're Brad Pitt, indeed, that's where they are. But for most of us, they're a little bit different than that. And you can see on this picture of the rock, the blue line indicates where the center point from the top of the head to the chin is. And his eyes are actually a little bit higher than that. So this is the kind of thing you got to be really careful of, and what's super important because it's what makes us look like us. So my next line is going to be his eye line, and it's not going to be dead center. It's going to be a little bit higher than center. And I'm going to begin putting in things like this line, which is sort of the midsection of the nose. That indicates where everything's going to build off of that. You can see because his head's turned, that line is further to the right. The left side of the face, which is actually his right side of the face, we're going to see more of. And I'm just indicating very lightly, very simply, where certain key features will be. Not all of these lines will be right. The key to drawing is not about getting the lines right the first time. It's about understanding where the lines are wrong and how to correct them. Okay, so here's an example of some of the lines that I'm kind of putting in, right? They're not always the same for me. It really depends how I attack a particular reference. But it gives you an idea of the type of things I'm looking for. The corner of the eyes where they line up, or the nostrils where they line up, things like that. One of the biggest features of the rock, and especially in this image, is his big smile. So I'm going to make that prominent. He's got quite a wide nose. That's another thing that I'm looking at. But overall, I'm just going back and forth between different areas of the face, as you can see, to figure out what I need to work on. His mouth is also a little bit different than the norm. You can see that traditionally the midpoint between the top of the nose and the chin is the bottom of the lip, and his is just a little higher than that. So that's again something that I've got to pay attention to as I'm drawing him. So here I'm going to just lay in a little bit of the neck and the clothing, just so I've got a bit of a sense of what's going on around him, and so the head's not sort of floating on the page. But you'll notice that overall I'm going back and forth between different parts of the picture, right? Where are the key points? Measuring, always measuring. The chin versus the mouth versus whatever. Here I've determined that there's something not quite right about his mouth. I'm not quite sure what. I think I felt like his lips were maybe a little bit too wide at the top and maybe not right at the bottom. And so I erased it. I don't normally erase a lot. Most of the time I actually will work over top of areas. But on the white paper I find sometimes the lines can be a little bit distracting. So it's easier sometimes to go back in and redraw them. I've also now determined that his chin is wrong, and that's something that I have to figure out. Here's another tip. The bridge of the nose, or the length of the nose, is one of the great key points to use. You can see that on a lot of people, the nose is roughly a third of the size of the face. It's a little different on him, but enough. So now I'm going to go back in and try to adjust that chin. I know there's something wrong with it. And so I'm sort of working it off against other elements of the face. Because as I said, really what it's all about when you're doing a drawing like this is correcting, right? Trying to figure out what the key points are, coming back to them. I know that his nose is quite prominent because it's quite wide, so it's as good a starting point as any to start to refine some of the drawing. Again, even though you can see that these lines are darker, they're still very light in comparison to what they're going to end up being, and that allows me to erase things. One of the things I mentioned earlier is that things like shadows, highlights, those are key features too, and you can see that I'm using shadows as a measuring tool as well as, you know, the nose and the mouth and what have you. Probably time to start around the face, around the eyes. The eyebrows are often something that I sort of indicate even before I get to the eyes. The way that the head folds back, and especially if it deep set eyes, you'll see that that is kind of an important feature to really sort of work out. I'm drawing in those lips, and I think they're a little bit too thin at the bottom. I can see that as I'm looking back at it again, and I believe I realized that as I was drawing it, although I'm not sure at what point I figured that out. So now I'm back up at the eyebrows, and the pattern that you're seeing establish is that I don't work on the eyes and then the nose and then the mouth. I'm constantly jumping around between different parts, and that's really very crucial when you're trying to establish a likeness, because it's all about measuring one part against another. It's really very, very important to make sure you've got everything coming together at once. So that chin's still bugging me. It is still not broad enough. And the reason why I think I had to try it a couple times is The Rock has a very pronounced chin. It's part of his big, you know, action star thing. He's got this huge chin. And the first time I drew it was sort of like a normal person, and the second time I exaggerated, but it still wasn't exaggerated enough. But Now it's starting to come together. It's starting to look like his chin, I think. Um, and I'm following along the same line up top. Okay, and now I'm tying in the eye, or the ear rather, sorry. Because as I said, I was probably spending a little bit too much time on the one side of the face, and it's definitely important to try and tie everything back together, right? You'll notice that my strokes tend to be very thoughtful. I won't just rush in. There's a lot of thinking, and then I'll attack with a stroke. Here, back onto the mouth, and I just wanted to show the reference once again because I think it's important to constantly go back and forth between the two. I mentioned earlier that that lip was too thin at the bottom, and so I guess at this point I've realized it. I know now because I drew it before. So, but I know at one point I hadn't figured that out. But you can see just with that one little change already, he's starting to look a little bit more like himself. And at this stage, we still really don't have that many key features in. I'm not sure what the total drawing time is so far. I think I'm up to about 8 or 9 minutes, but you're already starting to establish a look and what the rock really is, right? What he looks like. Um, up until this point, I haven't spent a lot of time on his jawline, just his chin, but this all kind of ties it together, which is obviously very important because um, sometimes you will get a lot of the features right, but if you don't have the other elements in, things won't look right. So don't automatically assume that if your drawing looks wrong, that you've got something in the wrong place. A lot of times I don't erase things. You can see here I am. I find on the white paper I erase more often than on toned, just because initial lines that I put down might be a little bit more distracting. But there's certainly no harm in erasing. If you're using a good quality paper, then you should be able to erase multiple times without any real problem. Now I've sped up the video a little bit here because I think I'm sort of running out of things to say. It's mostly the same things, right? Um, so already we're getting a lot of the block in established. I'm going to define the eyes a little bit more. You can see that I really indicate the entire shape of the eye, the mouth, what have you. Eyes are so important when you're measuring. They're one of the best features because there are sharp edges in the corners. So you can use them throughout the drawing to figure out if the width of the nose is right, if the width of the mouth is right. Sometimes it's one eye, sometimes it's two eyes, whatever, but it's a good measuring tool. But now I'm just going back in and when you draw the eyes, remember it's not just the pupils and the iris, it's also the folds of skin, the crow's feet, everything else about the eyes. They're all very important in making those eyes look accurate and helping your portrait look like the person that you're drawing. Um, at this point, we're going about double, maybe 50% faster than I'm actually drawing it, but I am going to speed it up a little bit more. This is now about 200%, so about twice as fast as I'm actually drawing it. Just because, as I said, at a certain point, this sort of drags on. But you can see here that I am now starting to establish some of the values, some of the more, some of the stronger features themselves, his smile lines, all of those sort of key elements. And already after probably about 10 or 15 minutes of drawing, it's starting to look like Dwayne. He's a pretty recognizable guy, so that's pretty obvious. But I think that it's already, the main block-in is established now. So the block-in is funny because it's really oftentimes 10 to 15% of the drawing time compared with the rendering, and yet it's probably the most important part because if you have a block-in that's wrong and you're unable to fix it, it will never be right. no amount of rendering can fix a bad blocking. So at this stage, I had just actually switched my phone to time-lapse, just because I think that the basic of this video was blocking in, right? And now it's all about rendering, and so I don't want to spend too much time on going over every little stage of it. There's lots of videos on my page here that have different types of rendering and explanations and tutorials, but I think the main part of this one was all about the block-in. So hopefully that's helped you guys. You can see me rendering. I probably recorded the next half an hour altogether, and at the end of this video I'll put the finished piece. Um, yeah, hopefully that helps. As I said, unfortunately, I know that it probably won't help you overnight become a better artist, but maybe it gives you some idea of things that you could work towards. And remember that unless you look like this guy, most of the time the features are not exact, right? You can see on him like every one of his features is in the right place, but for most of us, that's not the way it is. So here's the finished drawing. It was just a fun little quick sketch of the rock, and I hope you guys enjoyed the tutorial. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them down below. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and you can also have a look at my stuff on Instagram. Thanks very much, and take care.